Canada finds itself in a new fiscal reality shaped by forces well beyond domestic political preference. The economic and geopolitical environment has changed so fundamentally that deficit spending is no longer a tool deployed at leisure. It is increasingly a requirement to preserve national capacity, competitiveness, and economic sovereignty. The combination of aggressive U.S. tariff policy and a global order fractured by trade weaponization, supply chain insecurity, and geopolitical rivalry has altered the country's fiscal baseline. Rather than asking whether deficits should exist, Canada is now confronted with the question of how to use them strategically to defend its economy in a turbulent world. The argument is largely correct. While governments always retain theoretical discretion over fiscal choices, Canada's current deficit trajectory is shaped overwhelmingly by external pressures. U.S. tariffs now function as a direct tax on Canadian output, employment, and investment returns. They depress private sector activity and weaken federal revenues at the same time they force governments to shield workers and industries from deeper economic harm. As global fragmentation intensifies, Canada cannot rely on markets alone to maintain competitiveness or resilience. Public spending becomes essential. Deficits today are less an expression of ideology and more a response to unavoidable structural shocks. Avoiding them would mean accepting economic contraction and permanent loss of capacity in multiple sectors. American tariffs create an economic squeeze that leaves Canada with fewer viable fiscal options. Each tariff absorbed by Canadian producers reduces margins, stifles investment, and weakens employment in exposed sectors. These pressures cascade into lower federal revenues while simultaneously raising the need for targeted support, adjustment programs, and counter-cyclical spending. In this environment, deficit spending becomes a stabilizing tool rather than a discretionary one. It offsets lost demand, prevents layoffs from becoming structural, and preserves Canada's industrial base. Without such support, the long-term costs, shuttered facilities, diminished exports, and eroded competitiveness would far exceed the costs of carrying temporary deficits. The global economy no longer operates under the familiar rules of stable, rules-based globalization. A new era of friendshoring, strategic tariffs, supply chain realignment, and sanctions has elevated the cost of standing still. Countries are now compelled to invest in resilience, domestic supply chains, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, defense capacity, and clean energy transformation. These are investments the private sector alone cannot undertake at sufficient scale when geopolitical risks are high. The result is structural pressure on public budgets. The fiscal environment Canada faces today is one in which deficits are not signs of excess but reflections of the capital demands created by global volatility. If Canada fails to invest, it risks falling irreversibly behind. Canada's deficits in this context are best seen as protective rather than expansive. They exist to prevent deeper recessions, protect industrial capacity from being hollowed out, and counteract the destabilizing effects of external shocks. Without these investments, Canada would face sharper contractions, long-term unemployment, and a loss of strategic autonomy in sectors ranging from clean technology to defense manufacturing. Deficit reduction undertaken too aggressively in this environment would likely worsen economic vulnerabilities, inviting decline rather than renewal. Deficits are functioning as shock absorbers, not instruments of short-term political indulgence. Necessity defines the existence of deficits, but not their purpose. Governments still choose whether deficit spending strengthens long-term productivity, builds resilience, crowds in private investment, and enhances national competitiveness, or whether it dissipates resources on low-impact or short-lived measures. Fiscal responsibility in this era is less about achieving balance at any cost and more about ensuring that every public dollar delivers durable economic value. The strategic question is not whether to spend, but how to spend wisely. Canada's current fiscal landscape is best understood as an externally constrained environment rather than a domestically engineered one. U.S. tariffs, global fragmentation, and strategic competition have transformed deficits from an optional tool into an economic defense mechanism. In this new world, the central question has shifted. It is no longer deficits or no deficits, but whether the deficits Canada carries will strengthen its long-term capacity or merely slow its decline. The stakes are high, and the choices Canada makes now will determine the resilience of its economy for years to come. The Parliamentary Budget Officer provides the core economic and fiscal projections that establish the scale of external shocks and their implications for federal finances. The Bank of Canada's Monetary Policy Report offers insight into how tariffs, uncertainty, and global fragmentation affect growth, investment, and the conditions under which deficits become stabilizing tools. The IMF Staff Discussion Note on Geoeconomic Fragmentation explains how structural geopolitical risks reshape the global economic order and constrain national fiscal choices. The OECD's Global Economic Outlook details how policy uncertainty and trade disruption weaken growth and force governments to use fiscal tools more assertively. The IMF Fiscal Monitor outlines how strategic, well-directed public spending can enhance growth and resilience, reinforcing the argument that the quality of deficits matters as much as their size. Viewers can pause here to view the full citations and follow links to the source material. For more fact-based content about Canadian politics, democratic health, economic trends, and rhetorical analysis, the Facts for Canadians platforms offer ongoing resources and educational material. These outlets aim to strengthen public understanding, improve media literacy, and support evidence-based democratic engagement.